Hi, let's look at solving some rational inequalities. So let's say you had x minus 2 over x is less than 0. So for which values of x would this be true? Well, we can start by, you know that the sign of this value, so if it's positive or negative, might change if it either crosses the x-axis or has an asymptote. So for example, if you have a graph, if the function has an asymptote, you see how here it's positive, but here it's negative. So the sign may change when there's an asymptote or when it crosses the x-axis, right? Here it's negative, here it's positive because it crossed the x-axis. So we can start by either finding the asymptotes and also finding the zeros. So let's make it equal to 0, minus 2. So solve this first. Equals to 0. Oops, 0. So you know there's a non-permissible value. This over x will give you an asymptote at x equals 0, right? X cannot be equal to 0. And the function will be equal to 0 when x equals 2, right? Because if x minus 2 equals 0, then 0 over anything, x, will just be equal to 0. So when x equals 2, this value of this function will be 0. So we have x cannot be equal to 0, it gives you an asymptote, and this function is equal to 0 when x equals to 2. So let's draw a number line. And you know there will be a non-permissible value here, an asymptote, and a 0 here. So remember, the signs may change only when it either crosses the x-axis or has asymptote, which is kind of similar to crossing the x-axis. So let's do some test points. So if we test -1 in this function, right, your function is x minus 2 over x. If we test -1, that'll be -1 minus 2 over -1, which is just -3 over -1, or just 3, which is positive, right? Positive. So this area is positive, right? Because we tested a number from this area. -1 is less than 0. And let's try testing a number from this area. How about 1? So if we test 1, you get 1 minus 2 over 1, which is 1 minus 2 is -1 over 1 will give you -1, right? Which is a negative number. So this region will be negative. Now what about this region? Let's test, how about 3? Test 3. And this one here was -1. Okay, so this will give you 3 minus 2 over 3. And that equals 3 minus 2 is 1. 3 is just 3. 1/3, which is positive. So this region will be positive. Now let's look at what we were actually looking for in this function. We want this function, x minus 2 over x, to be less than 0. So we want it to be negative. Now, it can't actually equal to 0 because that's a non-permissible value, right? It's undefined. And if it's equal to 2, then the function is actually equal to 0 at 2, right? Because 2 minus 2 is 0 over 2. 0 over 2 is just 0. So it'll have to be between these two values, non-inclusive. So x will have to be between 0 and 2. Or if you want to write it, well, that's an answer. It's a perfectly fine answer, but if you want it in interval notation, such some calculus teachers may expect this, you can write 0 and 2 and use parentheses instead of brackets, because that shows that 0 and 2 are not actually included. It's just the range between 0 and 2. So this is another acceptable answer. Alright, that's the end of this video. Hope you learned something.